Deep in the wilderness, Mason placed the final stone into the foundation of his crude cabin as thunder rumbled across the darkening sky. The 12-year-old's hands, once soft from city living, now bore calluses and small scars from 3 weeks of desperate survival. His fingers trembled, slightly not from the approaching storm, but from the realization settling over him like the heavy clouds above. No one was coming back for him. The torn photograph shook in his small hands, its edges frayed from constant handling. His family gathered around last Christmas's fire, his parents, his sister, and Uncle Nathan, with that confident smile that had convinced everyone he was the right man to lead the expedition into the mountains. Mason's thumb traced over the faces now seeming like strangers from another lifetime. His parents' tight smiles betrayed the tension of their failing marriage, a tension that had ultimately led to this character-building trip in with Uncle Nathan. It had been Uncle Nathan's idea to bring him along. "The boy needs toughening up," he had declared to the assembled men. "City life's made him soft. A few weeks in the mountains will put some backbone in him." Though Mason had caught their uncertain glances, the first week had been everything Uncle Nathan promised. An adventure beyond his wildest dreams. They'd hiked through forests that seemed to swallow the horizon, crossed crystal-clear streams, and camped under stars brighter than any city boy had ever imagined. Uncle Nathan had taught him to read animal tracks, identify edible plants, and build fires using just a handful of kindling. But the mountains had been harder than any of them expected. What should have been a 3-day hike to the mining claims turned into a week of wrong turns and backtracking. Food supplies dwindled faster than planned. Tempers grew short as each day brought new obstacles. Washouts, deadfalls, and trails that simply vanished into impossible ravines. The night before everything changed, Mason had lain awake listening to hushed arguments between Uncle Nathan and the other men. Something about the old map and Wright family claim that made no sense to him. One man insisted they were going in circles while Uncle Nathan maintained they were close to finding it. When Mason had asked about it over breakfast, the sudden silence and exchanged glances told him this was adult business. He wasn't supposed to question. Then came the morning when everything changed. Mason had awakened before dawn pretending to sleep while listening to whispered conversations. "We're 3 days behind schedule and winter's coming early this year. The boy's slowing us down. He can't keep the pace we need. There's shelter here, a good water source. He'll be safe until we come back. When after we reach the claims, that could be weeks. Better than having him die of exposure on the trail." But Mason caught something else in their whispers. Something about him knowing too much in the map. Uncle Nathan silenced that conversation quickly, but the damage was done. This wasn't just about him slowing them down. There was something else. Mason had squeezed his eyes shut, hoping this was just a nightmare that he'd wake up to find Uncle Nathan cooking breakfast and planning another day's adventure. Instead, he'd felt a hand on his shoulder and opened his eyes to see his uncle's weathered face filled with what might have been regret. "Listen, son," Uncle Nathan had said quietly. "We need to move fast now, and the trail ahead isn't safe for someone your age. You're going to stay here where there's good shelter and water. We'll be back in 2 weeks, maybe 3 at the most." Mason had wanted to argue, to promise he could keep up, to beg them not to leave him behind, but something in his uncle's voice told him the decision was final. Instead, he nodded and tried to look brave while his world crumbled around him. Uncle Nathan had left him with a week's worth of food, a tarp for shelter, and his old hatchet. "You're tougher than you know," his uncle had said, pressing the worn tool into his hands. "This will help you gather firewood and build whatever you need." Then came the wooden box, small with a simple lock. "If we're not back in 3 weeks, open this. It might help you understand. But not before then, you hear me? Promise me." Mason had promised, confused but too frightened to question further. Then they'd shouldered their packs and disappeared into the morning mist, leaving him alone with the echo of their footsteps and promises that felt increasingly hollow as the days passed. The first 3 days had been the worst. Mason built a crude lean-to against a fallen log and huddled inside while rain soaked through the tarp and turned the ground beneath him into cold mud. He'd rationed the food carefully, making each meal smaller than his growing hunger demanded. At night, he'd stared into the fire and told himself Uncle Nathan would keep his word. They'd come back. They had to come back. But as days turned into a week, then 2 weeks, the terrible truth settled over him like winter frost. The strange conversations he'd overheard, the wooden box with its mysterious contents, the way Uncle Nathan had avoided his eyes when making his promise to return. All of it pointed to one conclusion. They weren't coming back. None of them. Whether they'd found their claims or met some disaster in the high country, Mason was truly and completely alone. On the morning of the 20th day, Mason sat before his struggling fire, the locked wooden box in his hands. 3 weeks had passed. He could open it now, just as Uncle Nathan had said. His fingers traced the simple lock, wondering what could be inside that his uncle thought might help him understand. With a deep breath, he took the hatchet and broke the lock with a single decisive strike. Inside lay 3 items: a folded piece of yellowed paper, a torn journal page, and a strange brass key that seemed too ornate for the simple box that had contained it. Mason's hands shook as he unfolded the paper. A map clearly old with faded markings, showing mountains, a river system, and a location marked with a star labeled Right Claim 1871. Scrawled across the bottom in fading ink, the true legacy lies beyond the falls. The journal page was in a different hand, dated just 2 years ago. N continues to insist the old family claim contains untapped gold deposits worth millions. Says his great-grandfather's journal pinpoints the location, but the original survey was deliberately misrecorded. He's convinced Robert Wright stole the claim from our family, and the legal documents proving ownership still exist somewhere in these mountains. This is about more than money for him. It's about righting a historical wrong against the Bennetts. I fear his obsession has clouded his judgment. Mason stared at the page pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Uncle Nathan, Nathan Bennett, wasn't really his uncle at all, but a distant cousin who had ingratiated himself with Mason's father after discovering their family connection. The friendly hunting guide who offered to take his nephew on a character-building trip was actually searching for something that he believed belonged to his family. And Mason was a Wright. Robert Wright had been his great-great-grandfather. The realization hit Mason like physical pain. He hadn't been brought along to be toughened up. He was brought because he was a Wright, possibly to legitimize the claim if they found it. And then he'd been abandoned when he became inconvenient, or worse, when they realized he might have overheard too much. That night, as rain pelted his meager shelter again, Mason made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't just going to survive until rescue came, because he now understood rescue wasn't coming. He was going to survive permanently. And more than that, he was going to discover the truth about this Wright claim and whatever his supposed uncle was really after. The hatchet became his most valuable possession, an extension of his will as much as his arm. The first steps toward true survival came with his discovery of an abandoned hunting cabin half a mile from his camp. The structure was dilapidated, roof partially collapsed, door hanging from one hinge. But it represented something profound, proof that human beings could build and endure in this wilderness. Exploring the cabin cautiously, Mason discovered a trove of abandoned tools, a rusted axe head still sharp enough to use cooking utensils, rotting rope that could be salvaged in sections, and a crumbling leather-bound journal whose pages were mostly ruined by moisture. On the back wall, barely visible beneath years of grime, someone had carved a symbol that looked disturbingly similar to the star marking on Uncle Nathan's map. Something caught Mason's eye as he examined the doorframe, something that didn't belong with the aged, weathered wood of the cabin. A fresh cut, perhaps a few weeks old, where someone had tested a blade. Uncle Nathan, had he known about this place all along? As Mason stepped outside, a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Fresh boot prints circled the cabin, too large to be his, too recent to belong to whoever had abandoned this place years ago. Someone had been here, and recently. The prints led away toward the north, the same direction Uncle Nathan's expedition had taken. That night, huddled in the relative safety of the old cabin, Mason startled at every sound from the forest. The wilderness that had seemed merely indifferent to his survival now felt actively threatening. Someone might return, someone connected to Uncle Nathan, someone who wouldn't want a Wright boy learning family secrets. Morning brought a visitor, but not the one Mason feared. As he gathered firewood near the cabin, movement caught his eye. An old man stood watching him from the edge of the clearing, leaning on a hand-carved walking stick. Tall and lean, with a snow-white beard and deeply lined face, he wore clothes that seemed handmade from animal hides and rough-spun fabric. When he spoke, his voice was like gravel being tumbled in a stream. "You're Robert's boy, aren't you? Got his look about you." Mason froze, heart hammering in his chest. "I'm Mason Wright." My great-great-grandfather was named Robert, I think. The old man nodded slowly as if confirming something to himself. Thomas Wallace. I knew your grandfather when he came up these mountains 40 years back. You're a long way from home, boy. Over a small fire outside the hunting cabin, Wallace shared a portion of dried venison from his pack, while Mason explained his situation, vice. The expedition being abandoned, the mysterious map and journal entry. The old man listened without interruption, his weathered face giving away nothing until Mason mentioned the name Bennett. Nathan Bennett. Should have known he'd come back eventually. You know my uncle, I mean my cousin, Wallace, spat into the fire. He's no kin you should claim. The Bennetts and the Wrights have bad blood going back generations. All started with a gold claim in 1871 that your great-great-granddaddy supposedly stole from the Bennetts. Except he didn't steal anything. The Bennetts tried to jump a legal claim after Robert Wright found the original deposit. But there's really gold up here. Wallace's laugh held no humor. Gold land rights, timber rights. There's plenty of wealth in these mountains if you know where to look. But there's a bloody history too. Men killed over these claims. Your grandfather came up here in the 80s trying to find the old family mine. Nearly died when a shaft collapsed on him. I pulled him out. Mason leaned forward suddenly, desperate to understand. So what does Uncle Nathan want? Just to find the gold. The old man's eyes narrowed. The gold's played out long ago. Nathan's after the legal papers. The original survey and deed that proved the Wrights owned that land fair and square. There's a court case from back in the 30s that left ownership in limbo. Those papers would settle it once and for all. And that land is worth millions now with the timber and water rights. And he left me here because you're a Wright and he couldn't risk you finding out what he was really after. The old man's expression softened slightly. But he made a mistake leaving you. These mountains are in your blood, same as they were in your grandfather's. I can see it. Over the following days, Wallace became Mason's teacher and lifeline. The former forest ranger had lived alone in these mountains for 20 years, ever since retiring from service. He knew every ridge and valley, every plant and animal, every trick for survival in this unforgiving wilderness. Most importantly, he knew the history that Mason was now unwittingly part of. The first priority was proper shelter. The hunting cabin provided temporary protection, but its location was too exposed, too easily found by anyone following Uncle Nathan's trail. Together, they scouted locations and settled on a small clearing backed against a cliff face sheltered by a natural overhang and with good visibility of approaching trails. Under Wallace's guidance, Mason learned the fundamentals of survival that Uncle Nathan had only superficially taught him. The difference was stark. Uncle Nathan had shown him tricks, but Wallace taught him systems, the underlying principles that would work in any situation. That first tree nearly killed me, Mason confessed, as they examined the crude notches he'd cut into a young pine. Wallace adjusted Mason's grip on the axe. Respect the tree. It lived a long time before you came along. It deserves a clean cut and a purposeful death. The old man demonstrated the proper technique, how to cut a notch on the falling side, how to make the back cut slightly higher, how to step away at the right moment. Under his tutelage, Mason's second attempt was markedly better, the tree falling exactly where intended. Building the foundation came next. Wallace insisted on taking time to clear the ground properly and place stones for drainage and support. A man in a hurry builds twice, he explained, as Mason chafed at the slow progress. Get it right the first time. Each log had to be stripped, measured, and notched to fit with its neighbors. Mason's first attempts at corner joints were laughably bad gaps wide enough for squirrels to pass through. But Wallace never mocked his efforts, simply showing him how to improve with each iteration. While the physical lessons filled their days, evenings around the fire brought different knowledge. Wallace shared stories of the land's history, of the indigenous peoples who had lived there for thousands of years before European settlers arrived. He taught Mason tracking methods developed over countless generations, methods that white hunters had adopted and claimed as their own. The Cherokee believed these mountains were the backbone of the world, Wallace explained one night, as they watched stars emerge above the trees. They had medicine that could talk to animals, heal sickness, bring rain. Most of that knowledge is gone now, but some survived. My grandmother was Cherokee, taught me things about these woods that no ranger manual ever covered. Mason absorbed everything: how to set snares using the natural pathways animals preferred, how to read weather from cloud formations and bird behavior, how to find water sources that would remain reliable through drought. His body changed with the work baby fat melting away as muscle developed. His hands, once soft, became callous tools, as functional as the axe he wielded. The cabin walls rose steadily, each course of logs straighter than the last. Wallace showed Mason how to collect birch bark in large sheets, carefully peeling it from living trees in a way that wouldn't kill them. These became the waterproof layers of the roof, overlapped like shingles and secured with split wooden pins. As September gave way to October, they worked with increasing urgency. Winter would come early to these mountains, Wallace warned, and they needed to be prepared. Mason learned to smoke meat on racks built above carefully managed fires, preserving the results of their hunting for the lean months ahead. They gathered nuts, late berries, and edible roots, storing them in underground caches lined with stones to keep out rodents. Through it all, Mason found himself talking to Wallace about things he'd never shared with anyone. His parents' crumbling marriage, his difficulties fitting in at school, his sense of never quite measuring up to expectations. The old man listened without judgment, offering occasional wisdom that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his own experience. Mountains don't care if you're popular, he observed when Mason mentioned his lack of friends. They'll kill the quarterback same as the chess champion if either one gets careless. Up here, you're measured by what you can do and who you choose to be, not what others think of you. The day they finished roofing the cabin, Mason stood back to admire their work. It wasn't pretty by any conventional standard. The logs were uneven, the roof slightly lopsided, but it was solid, waterproof, and most importantly, it was his. He had built something real, something that would endure. We need to mark it, Wallace said, pulling out a small carving knife. Mason watched as the old man carefully etched the date into the log beside the door, then handed the knife to Mason. Your turn. Make your mark. Mason hesitated, then carefully carved his initials, M.W. Wallace nodded approvingly. Now you've claimed it. This is your place in the world, fair and square. That night, as they sat by the fire inside the finished cabin, Wallace's expression turned serious. Tomorrow I'll show you something important, something about your family history, but first we need to prepare. There are others in these mountains besides us, men working with your cousin Nathan. They're looking for something, and they won't be happy to find you here. Before Mason could respond, a sound froze them both, the distant crack of a branch breaking under weight too heavy to be animal. Wallace extinguished their fire with a handful of dirt, plunging the cabin into darkness. His whisper was barely audible. Get your pack. We may need to move quickly. They slipped out the back of the cabin, using a small gap Wallace had intentionally built into the design for exactly this purpose. The old man moved with surprising agility through the darkness, leading Mason up a narrow deer trail that skirted the edge of the clearing. From their elevated position, they watched as flashlight beams cut through the trees below, converging on the newly built cabin. Two men approached cautiously, rifles clearly visible in the moonlight. Mason recognized one of them, Greg, one of the younger members of Uncle Nathan's expedition. The strangers circled the cabin, clearly surprised to find such a new structure. Think the kid built this? Greg's voice carried clearly in the night air. No way. Must be a hunter. Or that old ranger Nathan mentioned. We should check inside. Mason's heart hammered as the men approached the cabin door. Wallace's hand on his shoulder kept him from making any sound or movement that might give away their position. The men spent several minutes searching the cabin, their flashlight beams visible through the small window openings. When they emerged, their conversation had taken on a more urgent tone. Someone's definitely living here. Recently built. Food stored. Nathan needs to know if someone else is searching this area. The mention of Mason, Greg asked. Still no sign. Probably dead by now. Mountain lions or exposure. Nathan will be pleased. One less right to worry about. The casual dismissal of his existence hit Mason like a physical blow. Uncle Nathan would be pleased to think him dead. The betrayal cut deeper than he'd imagined possible. The men departed, taking the trail north toward what Mason now understood must be their base camp. When they were well out of earshot, Wallace finally spoke. Now you understand what we're dealing with. These aren't just treasure hunters. They'll eliminate anyone who stands between them and what they want. They think I'm dead. Maybe that's good. Wallace nodded grimly. It gives us an advantage, but it won't last if they find evidence you're alive. We need to be more careful. No open fires during daylight. No unnecessary tracks. and we need to move your things from the cabin. It's not safe now." That night, they retrieved essential supplies from the cabin and relocated to a small cave Wallace knew of half a mile away and well hidden by dense undergrowth. As they settled in for an uncomfortable night, Mason's mind raced with questions. What are we going to do? Just hide until they leave? Wallace's eyes reflected the tiny flame of their well-shielded candle. No. Tomorrow we find the waterfall mentioned in your map. I think I know where those papers might be hidden. But first I'm going to teach you something else. How to defend yourself if it comes to that. The next morning brought a sobering lesson. Wallace produced a long hunting knife from his pack, its blade showing signs of regular use and maintenance. Mason recognized it as a serious tool, not the decorative knives sold in sporting goods stores. "I hope you never need to use this against a person," Wallace began. But hope isn't a strategy in these mountains. For hours, he taught Mason the fundamentals: how to hold the knife for different purposes, how to use it defensively rather than offensively, how to create distance from an attacker. Most importantly, he emphasized awareness and avoidance. "The best fight is the one you never have," Wallace repeated. "Watch, listen, think ahead. Animals survive by knowing their surroundings better than their predators. So do we." By midday, they were ready to move. Wallace led Mason along game trails that would leave minimal signs of their passage, avoiding muddy areas where footprints would be obvious. They traveled for nearly 3 hours, gradually ascending toward a ridgeline that Mason had seen from his original campsite but never explored. As they crested the ridge, the sound of falling water reached them, distant at first, then growing louder as they descended the other side. Wallace moved with heightened caution, now frequently stopping to listen and observe before proceeding. They crossed a small stream, using rocks to avoid leaving tracks, then followed its course upstream toward the increasingly loud roar. The waterfall revealed itself suddenly, a 30-foot cascade that dropped from an overhanging rock face into a clear pool below. The sight momentarily took Mason's breath away. Sunlight caught in the spray created dancing rainbows above the churning water. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Wallace's voice held reverence. "But we're not here for the view. Look behind the fall at the rock face." Mason squinted against the spray, trying to see what Wallace was indicating. It took several moments before he spotted it. A darker shadow within the shadow of the falls, a recess in the rock face partially hidden by the curtain of water. "Is that a cave?" Wallace nodded. "Not a natural one. An old mining entrance, probably dating back to your great-great-grandfather's time. This matches the location on your map. Beyond the falls. How do we get to it?" "Carefully, the rocks are slippery, and that water's cold enough to kill you if you stay in it too long. Follow me." "Exactly." Wallace picked his way along the edge of the pool, using natural handholds in the rock face to maintain balance. Mason followed, his heart racing as they edged closer to the thundering water. The spray drenched them, making the rocks treacherously slick underfoot. The final approach required passing directly behind the edge of the waterfall. The noise was deafening, the cold water shocking as it pounded Mason's shoulders and head. For a terrifying moment, the force nearly knocked him off balance, but Wallace's strong hand steadied him. Then they were through, standing in a small calm entrance barely visible from outside. As they moved deeper, leaving the roar of the falls behind, Mason saw clear evidence of human activity. Old timbers shoring up the tunnel walls, rusted metal tracks for ore carts, even the remains of tools abandoned long ago. Wallace produced a small flashlight from his pack, its beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a passage extending deeper into the mountain. They moved cautiously, aware of potential cave-ins or unstable flooring. The main tunnel ran straight for about 50 yards before opening into a larger chamber that showed signs of serious mining activity. Collapsed side tunnels suggested where veins of ore had been followed and exhausted. Ancient soot stains on the ceiling marked where oil lamps had burned. "Your great-great-grandfather worked this mine until about 1873. Wallace explained, his voice echoing slightly in the chamber. Then the main vein played out. The Bennetts claimed he jumped their claim, but court records showed Robert Wright filed first fair and square. The dispute turned violent. 2 Bennett men died in what was officially ruled a mining accident, but rumors suggested otherwise. "What are we looking for exactly?" Mason asked, scanning the abandoned equipment and debris. "Not what, where?" Wallace directed his flashlight toward what appeared to be a solid rock wall at the chamber's far end. "Watch." The old man approached the wall, running his fingers along its surface until he found something that made him pause. He pressed firmly, and to Mason's astonishment, a section of the wall moved slightly. It wasn't rock at all, but cleverly disguised wood and canvas painted to match the surrounding stone. Wallace pulled the false section aside, revealing a small recess cut into the rock behind it. Inside sat a metal box approximately the size of a large book, covered in decades of dust. "Your grandfather showed me this place just before he died," Wallace explained, as he carefully removed the box. "He made me promise to protect it until another right came to claim it. I never thought it would be a boy your age." The box was locked, but the key from Uncle Nathan's wooden container fit perfectly. Inside, they found a collection of yellow documents, the original mining claim survey maps with official government seals and legal papers documenting the court battles between the Wrights and Bennetts. Most significantly, there was a final court judgment from 1932 that clearly awarded ownership of not just the mine, but the surrounding 5,000 acres to the Wright family in perpetuity. Along with the legal documents was a personal journal belonging to Robert Wright himself, its pages filled with detailed observations about the land, the mining operation, and most interestingly, his conflicts with the Bennett family. One passage made Mason shiver as he read it aloud. "Bennett continues to threaten my operation and my life. Claims I stole his discovery, though any honest man knows I filed first. I fear not for myself, but for my children. This dispute will outlive me, as hatred runs deeper than any gold vein we might discover." There was something else in the bomb, a small leather pouch that, when opened, revealed a handful of gold nuggets the size of Mason's thumbnail. Real physical evidence of what had started the century-long feud between the families. So this is what Uncle Nathan is really after. Proof that his family's claims were false, that my family owns this land legally. Wallace nodded gravely. That land encompasses what's now some of the most valuable timber and water rights in the county, worth millions in today's market. Nathan wants to erase this evidence and establish Bennett ownership through adverse possession claims. Without these papers, your family's claim would be nearly impossible to prove after so many decades. A sudden sound from the tunnel entrance froze them both, the unmistakable scrape of a boot on stone. Wallace extinguished his flashlight, immediately plunging them into darkness, broken only by the faint glow filtering in from the tunnel. "Someone's here," Wallace whispered, his mouth close to Mason's ear. "Take the box. Go deeper into that side tunnel. Don't make a sound. What about you? I'll draw them away. Meet me at the White Pine Ridge if we get separated." "Go!" Before Mason could protest, Wallace was moving toward the entrance, deliberately making enough noise to draw attention. Mason clutched the metal box and slipped into the indicated side tunnel, feeling his way in the darkness. Behind him, he heard Wallace's voice echo through the main chamber. "Looking for something, boys. You're trespassing on Wright property." The response came in the form of a gunshot that reverberated through the confined space, followed by a cry of pain that Mason recognized as Wallace's voice. Heart pounding, Mason pressed deeper into the side tunnel, trying to control his panicked breathing, as footsteps and voices filled the main chamber. "Check the old man. Is he dead?" "Just winged him." "Where's the box?" Old-timers Wallace's response was defiant despite his obvious pain. "Gone where you'll never find it. Just like your claim to this land." Another voice joined in, one that Mason recognized with a chill. "Uncle Nathan, you've interfered for the last time, Wallace. Where's the Wright boy? We know you found him." As Wallace had instructed, Mason didn't stop to listen more. He crawled frantically through the narrow tunnel, guided only by touch and instinct. The passage twisted and descended, growing tighter, until he feared he might become stuck. Just as panic threatened to overwhelm him, his hand reached out and met emptiness. An opening. He emerged into a lower section of the cave system, this one showing no signs of mining activity. A natural formation lit dimly by sunlight filtering through a small opening far above. Mason waited, listening for pursuit, but the sounds from the main chamber were now muffled and distant. The reality of his situation crashed down upon him. Wallace was shot, possibly dying. Armed men led by his treacherous uncle were searching for him. He was alone in a mountain cave with no light source, clutching a metal box of century-old documents that people were willing to kill for. In that moment, something changed within Mason Wright. The fear remained, but alongside it grew something stronger: determination. Wallace had risked his life to help him to honor a promise made to Mason's grandfather. The old man had taught him not just how to survive in these mountains, but how to live with purpose and integrity. Mason wouldn't abandon him now. With the metal box secured in his backpack, Mason began searching for a way out of the natural cave. The filtered light from above suggested a possible exit, but the walls were too sheer to climb. Instead, he followed the cave's natural contours, hoping for another opening. After what felt like hours of careful movement through near darkness, a different quality of light appeared ahead. A horizontal opening rather than the vertical shaft he'd seen earlier. Mason approached cautiously, aware that any exit might be guarded. But the opening led to a narrow ravine hidden by dense undergrowth, apparently unknown to Uncle Nathan and his men. Once outside, Mason oriented himself using the sun's position and the mountain peaks visible above the trees. The white pine ridge Wallace had mentioned lay to the northeast, recognizable by the distinctive stand of massive trees crowning its summit. Getting there would require circling wide around the waterfall area, where Uncle Nathan's men were surely still searching. Moving with every bit of woodcraft Wallace had taught him, Mason began the journey. He stayed off established trails, used streams to mask his scent and footprints when necessary, and remained vigilant for signs of pursuit. Each snapping twig or bird call made him freeze senses, straining to determine if danger approached. As dusk fell, he found a hiding place among the roots of a fallen giant hemlock, its massive root ball creating a natural shelter. There, hungry and exhausted, he examined the contents of the metal box more carefully by the last light of day. Beyond the legal documents and gold nuggets, he found a folded paper he had overlooked earlier, a detailed map of the entire area showing not just the mine, but a network of trails, shelters, and caches that Robert Wright had established. Most intriguing was a location marked Emergency Cabin near the White Pine Ridge where Wallace had instructed him to go. That night, huddled in his inadequate shelter, Mason struggled with fear and guilt. Wallace was wounded, possibly dead, because he had helped a Wright boy. The responsibility weighed on Mason's young shoulders like the mountains themselves. Yet alongside the guilt grew a new resolve. He would survive. He would find a way to expose Uncle Nathan's schemes. He would honor Wallace's courage and his own family legacy. Morning brought heavy clouds and the threat of rain, conditions that would help conceal his movement but make travel more difficult. Mason continued toward the White Pine Ridge using the antique map as his guide. The terrain grew steeper, requiring scrambles up rock faces and careful descents into brush-choked ravines. By midday, the rain began, a steady, soaking downpour that turned the forest floor treacherous. Mason's clothes were soon drenched, his body temperature dropping dangerously. The risk of hypothermia became real, adding urgency to his need to find better shelter. According to the map, the emergency cabin should be less than a mile ahead, but in these conditions, visibility was reduced to mere yards. A sound cut through the drumming rain, a low growl that stopped Mason in his tracks. Slowly turning, he found himself facing a wolf. Greyford leaned and watching him with intelligent, yellow eyes. Not threatening, not yet, but certainly aware of the human intruder in its territory. Mason remembered Wallace's lessons about predators. Don't run, don't show fear, back away slowly without turning your back. He began to implement this advice when he realized the wolf wasn't alone. At least 4 others materialized from the undergrowth, effectively surrounding him. In that moment of terror, another of Wallace's teachings came to him. Wolves don't see humans as natural prey. They're curious, cautious. Respect them, and they'll usually respect you. Drawing on courage he didn't know he possessed, Mason spoke calmly to the lead wolf. I'm just passing through, not hunting in your territory, not a threat to you. The wolves watched, their posture alert but not aggressive. Mason continued his slow retreat, maintaining eye contact with the lead animal without directly challenging it. After what seemed an eternity, the wolf turned away, vanishing into the rain-soaked forest as silently as it had appeared. The others followed, leaving Mason trembling but unharmed. The encounter left him disoriented, and the increasing rain made navigation nearly impossible. Exhaustion clouded his judgment as he pushed forward, hoping to stumble upon the cabin before darkness fell. Instead, he found himself at the edge of a rushing stream, swollen by the day's rain to a dangerous torrent. The map showed no such water crossing on his route. Mason was lost, soaked, and rapidly approaching a dangerous level of fatigue and cold. In desperate need of immediate shelter, he spotted a hollow beneath a rocky outcropping, not ideal but enough to get out of the rain temporarily. As he approached the natural shelter, something caught his eye. a stack of firewood too neatly arranged to be natural. Someone had prepared this spot for use. Inside the hollow, he found more evidence of human presence, a small fire ring with ashes, a cache of emergency supplies in a weatherproof container, and most surprisingly, a note pinned to the rock wall, protected in a plastic sleeve. For any right who finds this place in need, your birthright is larger than you know. The note was signed simply, Wallace. The discovery hit Mason with a wave of emotion. Wallace had prepared this place perhaps years ago, honoring his promise to Mason's grandfather. The emergency supplies included waterproof matches, dried food, a blanket, and basic first aid materials. Everything a person might need to survive a night in desperate conditions. With shaking hands, Mason built a small, well-shielded fire using the dry wood from Wallace's cache. As warmth gradually returned to his body, so did clarity of thought. The map made sense again when he realized he had veered too far west during the rainstorm. The White Pine Ridge and emergency cabin were less than a half-mile east from his current position. That night, sheltered from the worst of the elements and fortified by the emergency rations, Mason made a decision. He would continue to the emergency cabin at first light, but his goal was no longer merely survival. Uncle Nathan and his men had shot Wallace, were hunting Mason himself, and sought to steal what rightfully belonged to the Wright family. It was time to stop running and start fighting back. Dawn brought clearing skies and renewed determination. Mason carefully resealed the metal box and secured it in his pack alongside the remaining emergency supplies. He left a note of his own in the hollow. "Thank you, Wallace. I will make this right." Following the corrected route, he reached the White Pine Ridge by mid-morning. The emergency cabin proved to be more substantial than he'd imagined. A well-built log structure partially dug into the hillside for insulation and camouflage. From most angles, it was nearly invisible among the massive white pines that gave the ridge its name. The cabin door bore a carving of a simple star, the same symbol that had marked the Wright claim on the map. Mason hesitated, then pushed the door open, half expecting to find Wallace waiting inside. Instead, he found an empty but well-appointed shelter. A wood stove bunks with blankets, shelves stocked with preserved food tools hanging from organized racks. This was no temporary refuge, but a permanent safe house maintained and ready for use. On the table lay a two-way radio, old but serviceable. Mason's heart raced at the possibility of communication, but caution tempered his hope. If he broadcast a call for help, Uncle Nathan might intercept it. Before taking such a risk, he needed to secure the documents and develop a plan. As Mason explored the cabin more thoroughly, he discovered something that changed everything. A trap door hidden beneath one of the bunks leading to a small root cellar. Inside, he found medical supplies, additional food stores, ammunition for hunting rifles, and, most significantly, a shortwave radio far newer than the one upstairs. Beside this radio lay a notepad with frequencies and codes written in a careful hand, topped with instructions, for emergency use only. These frequencies, monitored by Ranger Station, used code EPO, White Pine, for priority response. Mason stared at the radio, understanding its significance. This wasn't just a lifeline. It was evidence that Wallace hadn't been completely alone in his mountain vigil. He had maintained connections prepared for exactly this type of situation. A sound outside froze Mason in place, footsteps approaching the cabin. He quickly closed the trap door and slid the bunk back into position, then grabbed the hunting knife Wallace had given him. Heart pounding, he positioned himself beside the door, ready to defend himself if necessary. The door creaked open slowly. A voice called out weakly, "Mason." "You here, boy?" Wallace. Mason rushed forward as the old man stumbled through the doorway. His left shoulder darkened with blood, face pale from exertion and pain. Together, they secured the door and moved to the bunk. "I thought you might be dead," Mason said, hands shaking as he helped Wallace remove his blood-soaked jacket. Wallace managed a pained smile. "Takes more than Bennett Lee to kill me. But I won't lie. It was close." As Mason retrieved medical supplies from the root cellar, Wallace explained how he'd escaped. Nathan's men had left him for dead after the shooting, more concerned with searching for the metal box than confirming his demise. Despite his wound, Wallace had managed to find an alternate exit from the cave system and make his way toward the emergency cabin through sheer will and decades of mountain knowledge. Using the first aid supplies, Mason cleaned and bandaged Wallace's wound, a through-and-through shot that had fortunately missed any vital areas but caused significant blood loss. The old man was weak but stable, his chances good with proper rest and care. That evening, as Wallace slept fitfully on the bunk, Mason sat by the cabin's single window, watching darkness settle over the mountain forest. In the span of a month, he had gone from a soft city boy to a wilderness survivor. He had built shelter with his own hands face down, wolves navigated treacherous terrain, and now found himself guardian of both a wounded friend and a century-old family legacy. The metal box sat on the table before him, its contents representing not just legal ownership of land, but a connection to his ancestors, people who had faced their own challenges in this same wilderness. Robert Wright had stood against the Bennetts' threats and violence. Mason's grandfather had returned to reclaim what belonged to his family. Now the responsibility had fallen to Mason, the youngest Wright, to face this mountain's trials. Outside, an owl called into the night, its voice carrying across the ridge with haunting clarity. Mason watched the stars emerge above the massive white pines, feeling both incredibly small and somehow significant. These mountains had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Uncle Nathan and his men were still out there searching. The documents needed to reach proper authorities. Wallace needed medical attention beyond what Mason could provide. But for tonight, in this hidden cabin beneath the white pines, Mason allowed himself to feel something that had eluded him since being abandoned 3 weeks ago. He felt at home. Dawn found Mason tending the small fire in the cabin's wood stove, his movements careful to avoid waking Wallace. The wounded man had passed a restless night, occasionally mumbling in his sleep about Bennett men and the old claim. Though the bleeding had stopped, Wallace's forehead burned with fever, a worrying sign that infection might be setting in despite Mason's best efforts with the first aid supplies. Outside, a heavy mist clung to the white pines, shrouding the ridge in ghostly silence. Mason stepped onto the small porch, scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of movement or danger. The events of yesterday seemed almost dreamlike in the ethereal morning light, the discovery of the mine, the metal box, with its century-old secrets, Wallace's shooting the wolves. Yet the weight of the hunting knife at his belt and the dull ache in his muscles confirmed the harsh reality. A branch snapped somewhere in the forest below. Mason froze senses, instantly alert. Through gaps in the mist, he caught glimpses of movement, methodical, purposeful, human. Uncle Nathan's men were sweeping the ridge. Their search patterns suggested they knew the general area to focus on, though the cabin itself remained hidden by its careful positioning and the natural camouflage of the massive pines. Back inside, Mason knelt beside Wallace's bunk. The old man's eyes fluttered open, instantly alert despite his weakened state. "We've got company. Nathan's men are searching the ridge." Wallace struggled to sit up, his face contorting with pain. The cabin's hidden well, its entrance beneath a trap door behind the wood stove. "Get the documents down there, and yourself if they get close." Mason hesitated, unwilling to hide while leaving Wallace vulnerable. But the old man's expression hardened. "Those papers are more important than either of us, boy. 100 years of your family's history. Protection for this whole mountainside. Promise me." The determination in Wallace's fever-bright eyes left no room for argument. Mason nodded and quickly gathered the metal box along with essential supplies, water, food, the shortwave radio, a flashlight. He located the second trap door Wallace had mentioned, cleverly disguised as part of the cabin's rough-hewn floor. Below, stone steps descended into darkness. Just as Mason secured the hidden entrance, voices became audible, outside men calling to each other as they coordinated their search. He pressed his ear against the cabin wall, listening intently. "Nothing at the South Ridge crossing. This pine stand is next. Keep your eyes sharp. Wallace knows these mountains. He's got hiding places we haven't found yet." The voices grew louder as the searchers approached the cabin's location. Mason's heart hammered in his chest as he looked to Wallace, who was now sitting up, the hunting knife clutched in his hand. The old man motioned for Mason to take position behind the door, then spoke in a voice deliberately loud enough to be heard outside. "Been tracking deer sign all morning. Should have fresh meat by sundown if my shoulder holds up." Mason understood immediately Wallace was creating the impression that he was alone, speaking to himself as solitary mountain men often did. A clever distraction, but would it work? Footsteps approached the cabin, then stopped. Through a tiny gap in the wall planks, Mason saw a man in hunting gear standing at the edge of the clearing, looking directly at the cabin. For a breathless moment, discovery seemed inevitable. Then the man turned away, speaking into a handheld radio. Nothing but an old trapper's cabin up here. Looks abandoned. A crackled response came through the radio, and Mason recognized Uncle Nathan's voice despite the distortion. Check it anyway. Wallace has used that ridge before. The man sighed visibly, then began walking toward the cabin. Mason gripped the hunting knife, knowing that in seconds they would be discovered. Wallace caught his eye and shook his head fractionally. No violence unless absolutely necessary. The cabin door creaked open. The searcher stood silhouetted against the misty forest rifle held casually but ready. His gaze swept the interior, stopping abruptly when he spotted Wallace sitting on the bunk. Well, Thomas Wallace himself. Wallace nodded calmly, his face betraying nothing of the pain or fever. Been wondering when Nathan would send his hunting dogs up my mountain. The man stepped fully into the cabin, his confidence growing as he assessed the wounded old man. You're looking rough, old-timer. That bullet wound festering. Just a scratch. Takes more than Bennett Lee to put me down. The searcher moved further inside, glancing around the cabin for others. His eyes passed over Mason's hiding spot without pausing. Where's the right boy? We know you found him, dead most likely. Mountain's no place for a city kid. A smile spread across the searcher's face, cold calculating. See, I might believe that if we hadn't found fresh tracks. Small boots. Recent. Boy your age shouldn't be out alone telling lies. The man's gaze shifted suddenly, locking directly on Mason's hiding place. The game's up, kid. Come on out. Heart pounding, and Mason stepped into view, knife held defensively. The man's smile widened. Nathan's going to be real happy about this. 2 birds, 1 stone. Now, where's that metal box you took from the mine? Before Mason could respond, a low growl sounded from the doorway. All 3 humans froze as a large gray wolf stepped into the cabin, yellow eyes fixed on the armed intruder. Behind it, 2 more wolves appeared, their posture alert and threatening. The searcher's confidence evaporated instantly. He swung his rifle toward the animals, but Wallace's voice cut through the tension. I wouldn't. They're not hunting you, just watching. Make a move against them, though. As if understanding the words, the lead wolf bared its teeth, the growl deepening. The man backed slowly toward the window, his earlier dominance replaced by naked fear. Call them off, Wallace. Can't call what doesn't answer to me. They go their way, we go ours. Usually. In a sudden movement born of panic, the searcher lunged for the door, scrambling past the wolves, which snapped at his heels but didn't pursue. His footsteps pounded away from the cabin, accompanied by frantic shouts to his companions. Mason stared in disbelief at the wolves, which now stood calmly in the doorway, their aggressive posture gone. The lead wolf, the same one Mason had encountered during the rainstorm, regarded them with what almost seemed like curiosity before turning away. Within moments, all 3 animals had vanished into the mist as silently as they had appeared. Wallace leaned back against the wall, his brief show of strength fading as pain reasserted itself. Told you these mountains have their own ways of choosing sides. Those wolves have been watching you since you built that first cabin, deciding what kind of man you might become. Mason moved to check Wallace's wound, finding the bandages soaked through with fresh blood from the exertion. The fever hadn't abated, and the old man's breathing had become more labored. We need to get you to a doctor. Wallace shook his head weakly. Nathan's men will be watching all the trails down, and they'll have called in reinforcements after this. His gaze drifted to the window where the mist was beginning to lift, revealing patches of blue sky. But we have one advantage. They don't know about the shortwave radio or my contacts in the Ranger Service. Under Wallace's guidance, Mason retrieved the radio from the hidden well and set it up according to the written instructions. The frequency crackled with static before a professional voice responded to their call sign. White Pine, this is Ranger Station Delta. Over. Wallace took the microphone, his voice stronger than Mason would have thought possible. Delta, this is Thomas Wallace with emergency situation. Code Falcon. I repeat, Code Falcon. Over. The response was immediate, all protocol dropped. Thomas, my God, we thought you'd gone completely off-grid. What's your situation? Wounded, holed up at White Pine Cabin with Mason Wright, yes, Robert's grandson. We've got Nathan Bennett and armed men hunting us. Need immediate extraction and law enforcement. The boy has documents proving Wright ownership of the disputed territory. A brief silence followed, then understood. Stay put. Help is coming. ETA 3 hours by air. Can you hold that long? Wallace's eyes met Mason's, a silent question. Mason nodded firmly. We'll hold. but tell them to be careful. Bennett's men are armed and desperate. After signing off, Wallace explained the situation. The Code Falcon was an emergency protocol established years ago between Wallace and his former Ranger colleagues, a contingency plan for exactly this type of crisis. A helicopter would be dispatched to a small clearing, 2 ridges over, with armed Rangers and medical personnel aboard. For now, all we can do is wait and be ready to move quickly when the time comes. Nathan's men will have heard the searchers' report about wolves, but they won't retreat entirely. They'll regroup, approach more cautiously. Wallace's prediction proved accurate. Within an hour, movement was again visible in the forest below, more men moving in coordinated patterns that suggested military or law enforcement training. Uncle Nathan was escalating, bringing in professional help. The waiting was excruciating. Wallace's condition worsened as the morning progressed, his coherence coming and going in feverish waves. During one lucid period, he insisted on sharing critical information. Listen carefully, Mason. The documents aren't just about land ownership. The survey maps show water sources, springs that feed 3 counties downstream. That's why the land is worth millions now. Whoever controls those headwaters controls development for 100 miles. Your great-great-grandfather knew it even back then. Protected those springs in the legal language of the deed. This revelation cast Uncle Nathan's obsession in a new light. He wasn't just after gold or timber, he wanted control of the region's water supply. With climate change increasing drought conditions across the country, such control would be invaluable, worth far more than any long played-out gold mine. By midday, Wallace's fever had spiked dangerously high. Mason used the cabin's limited medical supplies to bring it down. Cool compresses, the last of the antibiotics. Careful hydration. The bullet wound itself was red and swollen, clear signs of infection taking hold. The 3-hour ETA for rescue suddenly seemed impossibly distant. A new sound carried through the trees, the distinctive crack of rifle fire followed by shouts. Uncle Nathan's men had encountered something or someone in the forest below. Mason risked a glance from the cabin's window and saw movement on the far ridge, uniformed figures advancing tactically through the trees. The Rangers had arrived early, but instead of approaching directly, they had engaged Nathan's forces to create a diversion. One particular figure caught Mason's attention, tall, moving with authority, directing others with hand signals. As the man turned, the sun glinted off the badge on his chest. Not a ranger, but a sheriff leading what appeared to be a joint operation. A burst of static from the radio preceded an urgent message. White Pine, be advised. Bennett forces between us and your position. Cannot reach you directly. Medical evac redirected to Falcon Point. Can you move your wounded to these coordinates? Mason consulted the map on the cabin wall, locating the mentioned coordinates, a bare rock outcrop just below the summit of the adjacent ridge. It would provide a clear landing zone for a helicopter, but reaching it meant traversing nearly a mile of terrain potentially covered by Uncle Nathan's men. Wallace was barely conscious now, in no condition to make the journey. Yet staying meant certain capture once Nathan's men regrouped and realized the cabin's location. The decision weighed on Mason with crushing pressure: risk moving Wallace and potentially worsen his condition, or wait for capture. That would mean losing both the documents and any chance of medical help for the old man. In that moment of indecision, Wallace's eyes opened with surprising clarity. You'll have to leave me. Take the documents, make for Falcon Point. Mason shook his head emphatically. Not happening. We're both getting out. A ghost of a smile crossed Wallace's pain-lined face. Stubborn like your grandfather. Then we'd better get moving, before I'm too far gone to help at all. Together they prepared for the desperate journey. Mason fashioned a rough travois from blankets and pine poles, a drag sled that would allow him to pull Wallace across terrain too rough for the old man to walk. They packed only essentials: water, the metal box of documents, the shortwave radio, and remaining medical supplies. Before leaving, Wallace insisted on one final precaution. From a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, he retrieved a small metal container. Distraction. Set on a 5-minute fuse. Old Ranger trick for backcountry fire management. Inside the container were what looked like professional smoke bombs, the type used by wildland firefighters to mark positions or signal aircraft. Wallace quickly demonstrated how to activate the timer, then handed them to Mason. Might buy us precious minutes if we need to disappear quickly. They left the cabin as the afternoon sun began its westward descent. Progress was agonizingly slow. The travois caught on roots and rocks despite Mason's best efforts to choose a clear path. Every jolt brought a barely suppressed groan from Wallace, whose fever now burned so hot that Mason could feel it radiating from several feet away. They had covered perhaps a quarter of the distance to Falcon Point when gunfire erupted again in the valley below. Closer this time, the sharp reports echoing off the ridge faces. Taking shelter behind a fallen tree, Mason peered through his improvised spyglass, a rolled tube of bark, to assess the situation. Uncle Nathan himself was visible now, directing at least 6 men in what appeared to be a coordinated sweep up the slope toward their position. On the opposite ridge, the sheriff's forces were pinned down by covering fire from Nathan's snipers positioned in the high ground. "We'll never make it to Falcon Point with them between us and the extraction zone," Mason whispered more to himself than to Wallace, who had slipped back into semi-consciousness. A sudden movement to their right caught Mason's attention, a flash of gray fur between the trees. The wolf pack had returned, the lead animal standing just 20 yards away, watching Mason with that same intelligent gaze he'd encountered before. After a moment, the wolf turned and moved parallel to the ridge, following a path Mason hadn't noticed, a natural depression in the terrain that would provide cover from anyone watching from below. The wolf stopped, looking back expectantly. Wallace, momentarily lucid, followed Mason's gaze and nodded weakly. "Told you, mountains choose sides." It went against everything Mason had been taught about wild animals, but instinct told him to trust this unexpected guide. He adjusted the travois and began following the wolf's path, staying low within the natural trench that wound through the forest undergrowth. The route was circuitous but effective, using the contours of the land to remain hidden from the searchers below. Occasionally, the wolf would stop, ears pricked, until some unseen threat passed. Then it would continue, leading them steadily toward the eastern face of the ridge, away from both Falcon Point and the approaching danger. Mason's confusion grew as they diverged further from their intended destination. Was he making a fatal mistake, trusting an animal's random movements? Yet the wolf's behavior seemed anything but random, its path too deliberate to be coincidence. After nearly an hour of this maddening indirect travel, they reached a small clearing where the wolf stopped and sat as if waiting. Beyond the clearing, Mason could see the ridge dropping away steeply. They had reached the far side of the mountain, opposite from both their pursuers and their rescuers. Wallace stirred on the travois, his eyes finding the wolf with something like recognition. Echo Canyon, the old Cherokee Trail. Smart route. Mason scanned the edge of the clearing and suddenly understood. Almost invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for, a narrow trail snaked down the steep eastern face of the ridge, a natural chimney that would allow rapid descent to the canyon below. The wolf stood, shook itself, and trotted to the trail entrance. There it paused once more, looking back at Mason before disappearing down the path. The message couldn't have been clearer had it been spoken aloud. This way to safety. With renewed energy born of desperate hope, Mason carefully maneuvered the travois to the trail entrance. The path was too narrow and steep for the drag sled, so he would have to carry Wallace. Despite the old man's lean frame lifting him onto his back, tested the limits of Mason's strength. "You can't carry me all that way," Wallace protested weakly. "Leave me. Take the documents." Mason adjusted his grip, securing Wallace's arms around his neck. "My grandfather wouldn't leave you in that mine shaft. I'm not leaving you on this mountain." The descent was a nightmare of loose rocks, precarious footing, and the ever-increasing weight of Wallace against Mason's back. Every step demanded total concentration. One slip would send them both tumbling hundreds of feet down the rocky face. Sweat poured into Mason's eyes despite the cool mountain air, and his legs began to tremble with fatigue before they were halfway down. He paused on a small ledge, gasping for breath, when a distant sound reached him, the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors approaching from the west. The medical evacuation was proceeding to Falcon Point, but they were now on the opposite side of the ridge with no way to signal their position. In that moment of despair, Mason remembered Wallace's smoke bombs. He eased the old man down onto the ledge and retrieved one of the devices from his pack. The label indicated it would produce dense yellow smoke visible for miles, perfect for signaling aircraft. The only question was timing. If he set it off too soon, Uncle Nathan's men might spot it before the helicopter. Too late, and the aircraft would never see it. Mason waited, listening intently as the sound grew louder, indicating the helicopter was now on the far side of the ridge near Falcon Point. Now or never. Mason activated the timer and wedged the smoke bomb into a crevice on the exposed face of the cliff where it would be visible from the air. Then he huddled with Wallace against the rock wall, counting down the seconds until detonation. The device functioned exactly as promised. With a soft pop, it began emitting a dense cloud of bright yellow smoke that billowed outward from the cliff face, creating an unmistakable signal against the forested backdrop. Mason held his breath, straining to hear if the helicopter's sound pattern changed, the only indication they would have that the pilots had spotted their distress signal. For long moments, nothing changed. The rotors continued their steady rhythm, seemingly oblivious to the smoke column now streaming into the sky. Then, just as hope began to fade, the sound pattern altered, the pitch changing as the aircraft banked sharply. "They've seen it. They're coming our way." The helicopter appeared around the shoulder of the ridge, a sleek black and green Forest Service model with rescue capabilities. It hovered cautiously at first, the crew obviously trying to assess the situation before committing to a dangerous mountain rescue. Using Wallace's emergency signal mirror, Mason reflected sunlight toward the aircraft in the pattern the old ranger had taught him. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short. The universal SOS. The helicopter responded by moving closer, hovering about 50 yards out from the cliff, which where Mason and Wallace were perched. The downdraft from the rotors whipped the smoke away and sent small stones skittering down the slope. A crewman leaned out, surveying the ledge with binoculars, then disappeared back inside to confer with the pilot. After what seemed an eternity, the helicopter edged closer, maneuvering carefully in the confines of the narrow canyon. The crewman reappeared, now harnessed and preparing to descend on a rescue line. With expert precision, the pilot held position while the rescuer was lowered to the ledge. The man was in his 30s, wearing a Forest Service uniform with paramedic insignia. He secured himself to the rock face before approaching. Thomas Wallace Mason Wright. His eyes widened as he took in Wallace's condition. "We need to move fast. Your friend needs immediate medical attention." Working efficiently, the paramedics secured Wallace in a rescue basket while explaining the situation. Sheriff's deputies have Bennett and 3 of his men in custody. The others scattered when the helicopter arrived. The sheriff's been trying to build a case against Bennett for months: illegal timber harvesting, environmental violations. But nothing stuck without proof of ownership disputes. The paramedic glanced at Mason's backpack. "Those documents you mentioned over the radio could be the missing piece." Within minutes, Wallace was secured and being hoisted up to the hovering helicopter. The paramedic then prepared Mason for extraction, fitting him with a rescue harness. As Mason waited for the harness line to go taut, his gaze was drawn to movement at the tree line below. The wolf pack had emerged from the forest, the lead animal sitting calmly at the edge of the clearing, watching the rescue operation with that same unnerving intelligence. "Thank you," Mason whispered, knowing the words couldn't possibly be understood yet, feeling they needed to be said. As if in response, the lead wolf threw back its head and howled a sound both mournful and triumphant that echoed off the canyon walls. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared throughout Mason's ordeal, the wolves melted back into the forest and were gone. The helicopter delivered them to a small regional hospital where Wallace was immediately taken into surgery to clean and repair his gunshot wound. The infection had progressed dangerously far, and doctors warned Mason that recovery would be long and uncertain, particularly for a man of Wallace's age. In the hospital waiting room, Mason met Sheriff Daniels, a tall, serious man in his 50s who had led the operation against Uncle Nathan's forces. The sheriff's interest in the metal box and its contents was immediate and professional. "Been trying to nail Bennett for years. Man's been buying up property all over the county, using shell companies and dummy corporations, intimidating holdouts, damaging environmental resources. But he's careful, always one step removed from the dirty work." The sheriff carefully examined the century-old documents from the metal box, his expression growing increasingly impressed as he turned the fragile pages. "This is remarkable. Original survey maps, water rights documentation, mineral claims, court judgments, all perfectly preserved. And that final judgment from 1932 is unambiguous. The Wright family owns that entire watershed, 5,000 acres of the most valuable land in the county." Mason watched anxiously as the sheriff handled the family legacy. "What happens now? First, we get these authenticated and filed properly with the county recorder. That establishes legal ownership definitively." Sheriff Daniels' face hardened. "Then we add multiple felony charges to what Bennett's already facing. Attempted murder, conspiracy, illegal weapons possession on federal land. Your testimony and Wallace's will be crucial. The realization that his ordeal wasn't over, that he would need to face Uncle Nathan in court, sent a chill through Mason despite the hospital's warm interior. The sheriff noticed his reaction and softened his tone. That's for later. Right now we need to contact your parents. They've been searching for you since you were reported missing 3 weeks ago. The reunion with his parents the following day was a storm of emotions. His mother arrived first, bursting into the hospital waiting room with a cry that was half sob, half exclamation of joy. Past weeks, her tears gathered Mason into an embrace so tight it nearly matched the physical ordeals. His father arrived an hour later, having caught a later flight from the city. The man who stepped hesitantly into the hospital room seemed smaller somehow than the father. Mason remembered his face lined with weeks of worry, his confident posture replaced by the tentative movements of someone afraid to believe what he was seeing. I thought we'd lost you. The words were barely audible as his father pulled him close, all the tension of their pre-trip arguments forgotten in the miracle of reunion. The story emerged in pieces over the following days as Mason alternated between spending time with his recovering parents and sitting vigil at Wallace's bedside. Uncle Nathan, whose actual relation was indeed that of a distant cousin on his father's side, had approached the family 6 months earlier, re-establishing contact after years of estrangement. He had presented himself as a successful outdoor guide and hunting outfitter, offering to take Mason on an expedition to build character during a difficult time in the family. What we didn't know, his father explained, shame evident in his voice, was that Nathan had spent years researching the old family land claims. He knew there was a legal battle over ownership back in the 1930s, but he needed access to family documents to find the exact location. When those didn't turn up in our attic or storage, he decided the records must still be hidden in the mountains themselves. And he used our family troubles to gain access. The family troubles his father referenced so obliquely were now out in the open as well. His parents had been separated for nearly a year, their marriage strained by his father's workaholic tendencies and his mother's resentment over repeated broken promises. The crisis of Mason's disappearance had forced them to work together to remember what they valued beyond their differences. We've been in counseling, his mother admitted, her hand finding his father's across the hospital cafeteria table. There's still a lot to work through, but losing you, thinking we'd lost you forever, put everything in perspective. Mason absorbed these revelations with complex emotions. Part of him wanted to rage at his parents for entrusting him to Uncle Nathan for being so absorbed in their own problems that they failed to see the danger. But another part, the part that had faced wolves and blizzards, that had built shelter with his bare hands and carried a wounded man down a mountain, recognized the futility of dwelling on blame. What mattered was moving forward, using what he'd learned to build something stronger than before. On the 5th day, Wallace finally regained full consciousness. Though weak from infection and blood loss, the old ranger's mind was sharp as ever. His first request was to speak with Mason alone. You saved my life, boy, not just on that mountain, but by coming into these woods in the first place. Been alone too long, forgotten what it means to fight for something beyond just surviving. Mason shook his head, uncomfortable with the praise. You've been saving me since the day we met. I'd have died without your help. Wallace's weathered hand found Mason's, the grip surprisingly strong for someone so recently at death's door. That's not how it works. We saved each other like people are supposed to do. Your grandfather understood that. Now you do too. The conversation turned to practical matters, what would happen with the land, with Uncle Nathan, with Mason himself. Wallace had already spoken with Sheriff Daniels about the legal proceedings to come. Nathan and his captured men faced multiple felony charges, with more co-conspirators being identified daily as the investigation expanded. The Wright family land claim had been authenticated and formally recorded with the county. As the legal heir, Mason's father would be the technical owner until Mason came of age, but Wallace had a proposal. That land should be protected, not developed. Those headwater springs feed 3 counties. The forests clean the air for thousands of people who'll never set foot in them. Your great-great-grandfather knew that when he added those conservation clauses to the original deed. Mason had been thinking along similar lines, the experiences of the past month reshaping his understanding of wilderness and its value. What are you suggesting? A conservation trust? Legal arrangement that would protect the land permanently while allowing sustainable use. Hunting limited timber, harvest scientific research education. The sheriff knows good environmental lawyers who could draw it up. Before Mason could respond, Wallace continued, his voice dropping to ensure privacy despite the empty hospital room. There's something else you should know. Those wolves that kept appearing, that's not normal behavior. I've lived in these mountains for 30 years and never seen wolves act that way with humans. Something about you called to them. Old Cherokee would say, you have a spirit connection, what modern folks might call animal magnetism. Mason thought back to his multiple encounters with the wolf pack, particularly the lead animal that had seemed to deliberately guide them to safety. What does it mean? Wallace's eyes held a mixture of wonder and certainty. It means these mountains claimed you just as much as you claim them. You belong to this place now, no matter where life takes you. Over the following weeks, as Wallace's condition improved enough for transfer to a rehabilitation facility, the legal processes began in earnest. Mason and his parents worked with environmental attorneys to establish the Wright Mountain Conservation Trust, a legal entity that would protect the 5,000 acres in perpetuity while allowing limited human activity under strict ecological guidelines. Uncle Nathan remained in custody, denied bail due to flight risk and the serious nature of the charges. The investigation had expanded to include his business dealings throughout the region, uncovering a pattern of environmental violations, fraud, and intimidation spanning more than a decade. The media initially swarmed around the story, the city boy abandoned in the wilderness, who not only survived but uncovered a century-old land dispute and brought down a local power broker. Mason avoided interviews uncomfortable with the attention and protective of the mountain secrets. He allowed the sheriff's department to handle press inquiries, focusing instead on processing his experiences and helping to establish the Conservation Trust. As autumn painted the mountains in brilliant oranges and reds, Mason made a decision that surprised his parents but felt inevitable to him. He asked to delay his return to city schools, requesting instead to spend the winter in the mountains, splitting his time between Wallace's rehabilitation facility and the ranger station where he had been offered an informal apprenticeship. Your education is important, his father protested, though, without real conviction. You can't just put your life on hold. Mason stood at the hospital window watching golden aspen leaves dance on the October breeze. He thought of the cabin he'd built with his own hands, of Wallace's patient teachings of wolves that appeared when needed, most of ancient documents hidden in mountain mines and century-old family legacies. I'm not putting my life on hold. I'm finally starting it for real. His mother, surprisingly, was the first to understand. After initially resisting the idea, she visited the mountains herself, allowing Mason to show her the rebuilt cabin, the white pine ridge, the waterfall concealing the old mine entrance. She watched her son navigate the wilderness with a confidence she barely recognized, speaking knowledgeably about plants and weather patterns, moving through the forest with a quiet assurance that bordered on grace. You really do belong here, don't you? Her question held no judgment, only wonder at the transformation before her. Mason nodded, unable to fully articulate the connection he felt to these mountains and forests. It's like I was asleep before, just going through motions without really seeing or feeling anything. Now everything's alive, important, connected. In late October, with the first dusting of snow already whitening the highest peaks, Mason stood with Wallace on the porch of the ranger station where the old man would spend the winter recovering. Below them stretched the valley, its forests a patchwork of evergreen and deciduous trees preparing for winter's dormancy. In the distance, the white pine ridge stood sentinel against the skyline, the hidden cabin now properly stocked and secured for the coming season. Winter up here will test everything I taught you, Wallace cautioned, his voice stronger now, though he still needed a cane to walk. Different challenges than summer, different dangers. Mason nodded, eyes on the distant mountains that had nearly killed him, yet somehow brought him more fully to life than he'd ever been before. I know, but I'm not the same person who was abandoned here 3 months ago. These mountains made sure of that. Wallace studied him thoughtfully, noting the lean strength that had replaced boyish softness, the quiet confidence that had grown from desperate survival. No, you surely aren't. You're a Wright through and through now, mountain-tested, mountain-approved. As if summoned by the words, a long, mournful howl echoed across the valley, the distinctive call of the wolf pack that had saved them on the cliff face. Both humans turned toward the sound, a shared smile of recognition passing between them. Your friend's checking in, Wallace observed. Good sign for the winter ahead. The following day brought the first significant snowfall of the season. Mason stood outside the ranger cabin as fat, white flakes descended from a slate-gray sky, coating the world in pristine silence. 3 months ago, such weather would have terrified him, a city boy unprepared for wilderness challenges. Now he read the snow with knowledgeable eyes, assessing accumulation rates and wind patterns already planning adjustments to his daily routines. A movement at the forest edge caught his attention, a flicker of gray against the whitening background. The wolf stood watching him, its yellow eyes unblinking in the fading afternoon light. Not threatening, not afraid, simply present, one mountain creature acknowledging another. Mason raised his hand in silent greeting. The wolf held his gaze for another moment, then turned and trotted into the deepening forest, its form gradually disappearing into the curtain of falling snow. He understood there was no need to follow. The wolf would return when needed, as would all the mountain's lessons and challenges. The snow continued falling as darkness approached, transforming the familiar landscape into something new, yet strangely welcoming. Mason remained on the porch long after practical considerations would have sent him inside, watching the world disappear beneath winter's first blanket. In that moment of transition between seasons, between his old life and whatever lay ahead, Mason Wright made a silent promise to the mountains, to Wallace, to himself, and perhaps even to the wolves that seemed to have claimed him as their own. He would honor this place that had saved him, even as it tested him. He would protect the legacy that had been entrusted to him. He would become worthy of the name Wright and of the mountains that now flowed in his blood as surely as any inherited trait. The snow fell harder as night claimed the valley. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, wood to chop, trails to clear, supplies to organize. The mountains were never finished teaching those willing to learn. But for tonight, Mason simply stood watch, a young sentinel at the edge of his newly discovered kingdom, as comfortable in the falling snow as he had once been in city streets. These mountains had stripped away everything he thought he knew about himself, forcing him to build something new and stronger from the raw materials of necessity and courage. They had shown him capabilities he never suspected, strengths he couldn't have imagined in his former life. They had nearly killed him, only to resurrect him as someone both familiar and utterly transformed. Whatever challenges winter might bring, Mason would face them not as a visitor or survivor, but as someone who had earned his place in this ancient landscape, step by painful step, lesson by hard-won lesson. The mountains had claimed him, and he had claimed them in return. 1 year had passed since Mason Wright had been abandoned in the Appalachian wilderness by men who thought a city boy would never survive the mountains. The cabin that had once been a desperate shelter against certain death now stood as a testament to transformation. Its walls reinforced against winter storms, its roof redesigned for better snow, shedding its interior, arranged with the practical efficiency of someone who understood that in these mountains wasted space or effort could mean the difference between life and death. Mason stood at the edge of the clearing, observing his handiwork with critical eyes. At 13, he had grown several inches taller, his frame lean and wiry from constant physical work. The baby fat that had once rounded his face had disappeared entirely, replaced by angles that hinted at the man he would become. His hands, once soft from city living, now bore the calluses and small scars of someone who built and maintained his own world. The survival journal he'd started during those first desperate weeks now filled 3 leather-bound volumes, their pages documenting not just techniques for staying alive, but observations about the mountain's ecosystems, weather patterns, and the complex interrelationships between all living things that called this wilderness home. Wallace had encouraged the practice, teaching Mason that knowledge not recorded was knowledge that died with its keeper. Speaking of Wallace, Mason smiled as he spotted the old ranger emerging from the forest path that connected their cabins. Though the gunshot wound had healed months ago, Wallace still moved with a slight hitch in his step, the lingering reminder of his brush with death. Yet his eyes remained sharp as ever, missing nothing as he surveyed the improvements to Mason's homestead. "Been busy, I see. The splitting maul you made is working well. That's a winter's worth of firewood if I ever saw one." Mason ran his hand along the smooth handle of the tool he'd crafted from a hickory branch, following Wallace's detailed instructions. The steel head had been salvaged from the ranger station's equipment shed, its edge carefully restored through hours of patient filing and honing. The stack of split logs represented weeks of early morning labor before the summer heat made such work unbearable. Each piece had been carefully sized for the cabin's wood stove, the pile arranged to promote air circulation and proper drying. The attention to detail would have seemed obsessive to Mason's former self. Now it was simply how one survived. Wallace's approval meant more than any school grade ever had. The old ranger had transitioned from rescuer to mentor to something approaching family over the past year. Their cabin, separated by a 15-minute walk through mixed hardwood forest, formed the nucleus of Mason's new world, a world that expanded or contracted depending on season weather and necessity. Let's see that garden of yours. Tomatoes should be coming in strong by now. They moved together toward the cleared area behind the cabin where Mason had established his first serious attempt at cultivation. The neat rows of vegetables represented another evolution in his mountain education, from foraging and hunting to actually growing food, putting down literal roots in this place that had both tested and saved him. This garden would have been impossible a year ago. The soil, thin and acidic like most mountain ground, had required extensive amendment with composted materials and careful attention to drainage patterns. But the results spoke for themselves: robust tomato plants, heavy with fruit, beans climbing their poles, squash spreading their broad leaves across the dark earth, and a variety of herbs that provided both flavor and medicine. Wallace stopped to inspect a particularly successful tomato plant, his weathered fingers gently turning a ripe fruit. "You've got the touch, boy. Most first-time gardens don't yield half this well." Mason shrugged, uncomfortable with praise even now. "Just followed your instructions and the old journals from your grandmother." Wallace's eyebrows rose slightly. "The Cherokee planting wisdom. You actually tried the companion planting methods?" The ancient agricultural techniques from Wallace's partial Cherokee heritage had initially seemed like superstition to Mason Plant. Certain things together speak to the seedlings, follow the moon's phases. But he'd followed the instructions out of respect for his mentor, and the results were undeniable. Their conversation shifted to plans for the upcoming winter, the second Mason would face in these mountains. But the first he would enter fully prepared with adequate supplies, improved shelter, and the knowledge gained from surviving the previous year's harsh conditions. The radio crackled from inside the cabin, the solar-powered emergency communication system that connected Mason to the ranger station and by extension to the outside world. It rarely activated these days unless scheduled, making the unexpected transmission worth immediate attention. Inside, Mason adjusted the frequency dial, bringing the voice into clearer focus. The message was from Sheriff Daniels requesting an immediate callback from Wallace. The old ranger's face darkened as he picked up the microphone. "Something's happened. Sheriff doesn't make casual calls." The conversation was brief, Wallace mostly listening with occasional terse acknowledgments. When he set the microphone down, his expression had grown even more serious. "Nathan Bennett has been granted bail pending trial. Judge cited new evidence and reduced flight risk. He's out as of this morning." The news hit Mason like a physical blow. Uncle Nathan, the man who had abandoned him to DA who had shot Wallace and hunted them both through these mountains, was free. The legal proceedings against him had dragged on for months, delayed by procedural motions and changes in counsel. Mason had provided recorded testimony months ago, sparing him the trauma of facing his would-be murderer in court. The documents from the metal box had been authenticated and entered into evidence, seemingly ensuring Nathan's conviction on multiple charges. Yet somehow the man had managed to secure release while awaiting trial. Mason's hands clenched involuntarily, his hard-won mountain calm shattered by this unexpected development. "How they have the documents, the testimony, everything." Wallace shook his head grimly. "Sheriff says Bennett has new lawyers, expensive ones from Atlanta. They're claiming the documents might be forgeries, that your testimony is compromised by trauma and suggestion. Standard defense tactics, but apparently effective enough with this particular judge." The implications hung in the air between them. If Uncle Nathan was free, what would stop him from returning to finish what he'd started? The land dispute remained active despite the authenticated documents, with Bennett's lawyers filing motion after motion to challenge the century-old legal judgments. Too much money was at stake for him to simply walk away millions in potential water rights, timber, and development value. Wallace seemed to read Mason's thoughts. Sheriff's increasing patrols in the area. Bennett's been ordered to stay away from Wright property and from both of us specifically. Any violation would send him straight back to jail. But both knew how little such legal protections might mean in these remote mountains, where help was always too far away and too late in coming. They had survived their previous encounter through a combination of wilderness knowledge, desperate courage, and unexpected allies. Would they be as fortunate a second time? The days that followed took on a heightened vigilance. Mason found himself scanning the forest edges, constantly listening for sounds that didn't belong, noting any disturbance to the natural patterns around his cabin. He moved the hunting knife from its storage place to his belt, where it remained within easy reach day and night. Wallace increased his visits, often staying until dusk before returning to his own cabin. They established additional emergency protocols, cache locations, and signals. The wolf pack that had adopted Mason as an unlikely ally had been absent during the summer months following game into higher elevations, but Wallace assured him they would return with the cooler weather of approaching autumn. 2 weeks after Nathan's release, Mason received an unexpected radio call, not from Wallace or the ranger station, but from his mother. Since his decision to remain in the mountains, his parents had maintained regular contact through scheduled calls and monthly visits. They had returned to living together in the city, their marriage slowly healing through counseling and the shared experience of almost losing their son. His father had taken a more active role in establishing and overseeing the Wright Mountain Conservation Trust, while his mother had begun writing a book about Mason's survival story with his reluctant cooperation. This unscheduled call carried news that sent a jolt of alarm through Mason's system. "There was a man at our apartment building yesterday, asking questions about you, about when we visit, about the trust documents. The doorman thought he seemed suspicious and didn't let him in, but he took pictures of the building. Your father reported it to Sheriff Daniels, but I wanted to warn you directly. The intrusion of danger into his parents' world, a world that had previously seemed safely separated from the mountain conflicts, raised the stakes significantly. Uncle Nathan wasn't just a threat to Mason and Wallace in their remote cabins. He was potentially targeting the entire Wright family and the legal structures they had created to protect the mountain land." That evening, Mason hiked to Wallace's cabin through the golden light of late summer, the forest around him beginning to show the first subtle hints of autumn in scattered yellow leaves and ripening berries. He found the old ranger on his porch, methodically cleaning a rifle that Mason had never seen him use, a serious hunting weapon with a scope and well-worn stock. For deer season, Wallace explained, though his eyes suggested a different purpose. Legal to have it ready early. Their conversation moved quickly to practical matters: increased security measures, communication protocols, renewed vigilance. But beneath the tactical discussion ran a deeper current of understanding. The mountains had chosen them as defenders, not just of themselves, but of the land and waters that sustained countless lives downstream. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about standing ground against forces that would exploit and destroy for profit. 3 days later, Mason woke before dawn to the sound that had become his alarm system, the chattering of squirrels suddenly silenced, followed by the distinctive alert call of a blue jay. Something or someone had disturbed the forest's normal rhythms. He slipped from his bunk, fully dressed, a habit developed during his first desperate weeks in the wilderness, and moved silently to the window, careful to stay back from the glass where his silhouette might be visible. The pre-dawn forest revealed nothing obvious to casual observation, but Mason's year of wilderness living had sharpened his senses beyond what any city dweller would recognize. A slight movement near the edge of his cleared area caught his attention, too deliberate for wildlife, too cautious for a friendly visitor. Mason retrieved his hunting knife and the small pack he kept perpetually ready with essential survival gear. Through the back window, he confirmed no watchers stationed behind the cabin. Then, moving with practiced silence, he slipped out through his emergency exit, a small opening at the back of the cabin that Wallace had helped him design specifically for situations where the main door might be watched or blocked. Once outside, Mason used every skill he had developed over the past year to move invisibly through his own territory. He circled wide around the cabin using natural cover and the lingering pre-dawn shadows to conceal his approach toward the area where he had spotted movement. The intruder remained focused on the cabin, apparently unaware that his quarry was now behind him. As Mason drew closer, details became clearer. A man in his 30s, dressed in hunting camouflage that might seem appropriate to casual observers, but was wrong for the season and terrain. More tellingly, the rifle he carried was no hunter's tool, but a tactical weapon with a suppressor attached, illegal in these woods, and clearly meant for more sinister purposes than harvesting game. Mason recognized him as one of Uncle Nathan's men from the previous year's pursuit, not the one who had discovered them in the White Pine cabin, but another who had been present at the final confrontation near the cliff face. The realization sent ice through Mason's veins. This wasn't a random trespasser, but a deliberate threat, someone who had already demonstrated willingness to hunt humans through these mountains. Moving with extreme caution, Mason worked his way to a position where he could observe without being detected. The man was setting up a hidden observation post with a clear view of the cabin's main entrance, a hunter's blind disguised with local vegetation. The weapon and positioning left little doubt about intentions. This was surveillance at minimum, preparation for violence at worst. Mason needed to warn Wallace and contact the sheriff, but reaching his radio meant either returning to the cabin, potentially walking into an ambush, or circling miles out of his way to reach Wallace's cabin on foot. Neither option seemed viable with an armed threat so close to his position. The decision was made for him when a twig snapped behind him. Mason spun knife ready, only to find himself face to face with the lead wolf, the same animal that had guided them to safety during their escape from Uncle Nathan's men. The wolf regarded Mason with those intelligent yellow eyes, making no sound but clearly alert to the human intruder near the cabin. For a moment, Mason wondered if he was projecting human characteristics onto the wild animal. Then the wolf turned and moved deliberately away from both Mason and the hidden gunman, pausing after a few yards to look back expectantly, exactly as it had done during their previous crisis. Mason followed without hesitation, matching the wolf's silent movement through the underbrush. They traveled perhaps a quarter mile before the animal stopped at the edge of a small clearing. There, to Mason's astonishment, waited the rest of the pack, 4 adult wolves and 2 half-grown pups, all watching him with the same uncanny focus as their leader. Beyond the clearing, Mason could now hear the soft murmur of human voices. More intruders establishing what sounded like a base camp well hidden from any normal patrol routes. The wolves had led him directly to the heart of the threat. Moving with extreme caution, Mason positioned himself where he could observe without being detected. The scene confirmed his worst fears. 4 men, all armed with similar tactical weapons, establishing a concealed camp with communications equipment, supplies for an extended stay, and what appeared to be detailed maps of the area, including marked locations for both Mason's and Wallace's cabins. This was no simple intimidation tactic or impulsive act of revenge. This was a coordinated operation with specific objectives, and given the illegal weapons and concealed positions, those objectives clearly included violence. The lead wolf nudged Mason's hand with its muzzle, a gesture so unexpected and deliberate that it momentarily distracted him from the human threat. The animal moved a few steps away, then looked back with that now familiar, expectant gaze. Once again, Mason followed, trusting this unlikely ally more than he would have trusted most humans. The wolf led him on a circuitous route that eventually connected with one of the secondary trails leading toward Wallace's cabin. As they reached the trail junction, the animal stopped and sat its message clear, even without words. This path is safe. Follow it. Mason hesitated, torn between the need to warn Wallace immediately and the recognition that his own cabin was now being watched by armed men. Everything he owned, his journals, his tools, the supplies he had so carefully gathered, was effectively lost to him until this threat could be neutralized. The wolf made a soft sound, not quite a whine, not quite a growl, and nodded its head toward Wallace's cabin with almost human insistence. Then, in a gesture that left Mason speechless, it leaned forward and pressed its forehead briefly against his hand, before turning and trotting back toward the intruder's position, soon joined by the rest of the pack as they disappeared silently into the forest. The message couldn't have been clearer had it been spoken aloud. Go warn your pack. We will watch these invaders. Mason found Wallace already awake and alert, the rifle he had been cleaning, now loaded and within easy reach. The old ranger listened to Mason's report without interruption, his weathered face growing increasingly grave. 4 men, tactical weapons, communications, detailed maps. This isn't just Nathan acting out of anger or revenge. This is an organized operation. Military or mercenary background based on your description. Wallace moved to his radio but hesitated before transmitting. If they have proper equipment, they're monitoring law enforcement frequencies. Calling the sheriff directly might accelerate their timeline. Instead, Wallace switched to an alternative channel, a private frequency shared with a former ranger colleague who lived in the valley below. The message was brief, coded, and deliberately vague, but contained the essential information needed to alert authorities without tipping off the intruders. With warning sent, they turned to immediate preparations. Wallace retrieved a metal box from beneath a floorboard and removed a handgun, a compact 9mm that Mason had never seen before. Ranger service backup piece. Never needed it in 30 years in these mountains. Hoped to keep that record. The weapon disappeared into Wallace's jacket pocket. Together they gathered essential supplies, food, water, first aid materials, ammunition for Wallace's rifle, and communication equipment. Years of wilderness living had taught them both to travel light, but prepared, taking only what was necessary for survival and defense. They were preparing to move to one of their pre-established emergency positions when Wallace's radio crackled. The voice was unfamiliar to Mason, but Wallace's expression registered immediate recognition and alarm. Thomas Wallace. Been a long time. Remember me? Nathan Bennett's hand grazed the trigger guard. You cost me 6 months of jail time and millions in legal fees. But I'm a reasonable man. All I want are the original right documents. Hand those over and we all go our separate ways. Wallace exchanged a look with Mason, silently confirming what they both knew: the documents were secured in a bank vault in town as evidence for the upcoming trial. What Bennett was really offering was an opportunity to locate and eliminate both witnesses against him. The radio crackled again. I know the boy is with you, Thomas. My man watched him leave his cabin at dawn. Clever kid spotted our surveillance. But there's nowhere to run. We have both cabins covered in the main trails. Make this easy on yourselves. Wallace depressed the transmit button, his voice calm despite the gravity of their situation. Those documents are with the county clerk's office. Nathan, court evidence. Nothing here but 2 people you've already failed to kill once. A cold laugh came through the speaker. Always the righteous ranger. Fine. We do this the hard way. But remember, I offered a peaceful solution. The transmission ended, leaving an ominous silence. Wallace set the radio down, his expression grim but determined. He's trying to rattle us, make us panic. That's not how we survive this. We stick to our plan, move to high ground, use the landscape to our advantage, and wait for the sheriff's response. Their emergency position was a natural rock formation near the summit of the ridge, a jumble of massive boulders that created a defensible space with multiple escape routes and excellent visibility of the surrounding terrain. The approach required crossing exposed ground, but Wallace knew paths that utilized natural depressions and vegetation for cover. They moved out immediately, keeping to the densest sections of forest where visibility was limited. Mason led his year of daily travel through these woods, having honed his ability to move quickly and silently over difficult terrain. Wallace followed the rifle, now uncased and ready, his movements hampered slightly by his old injury, but still remarkably fluid for a man his age. They were perhaps halfway to their destination when the first shot rang out, the crack of a high-powered rifle, followed by the distinctive thwack of a bullet striking a tree trunk inches from Mason's head. Both froze instantly, dropping to the ground as bark fragments showered down from the impact point. 200 yards north ridge, Wallace whispered, indicating a position well above and behind them. Good shot. Military trained. Mason processed this information against his mental map of the terrain. Their planned route was now compromised. The elevated position gave the shooter commanding views of the approach to their emergency position. There's the dry creek bed, Mason suggested, referring to a seasonal watercourse that cut across the slope to their right. It's deeper than it looks. Could give us cover most of the way. Wallace nodded approval, impressed as always by his young protege's intimate knowledge of the landscape. Together they crawled to a depression that offered momentary concealment, then mapped a new route that would utilize natural features to shield their movement from the elevated sniper. The dry creek bed proved an effective path, its banks high enough to conceal them completely as long as they stayed low. Years of seasonal flooding had carved a channel nearly 4 feet deep in places, with overhanging roots and fallen logs providing additional cover from aerial observation. They had covered perhaps half the remaining distance to their defensive position when Mason froze, raising his hand in the silent warning signal. Wallace had taught him. Ahead, partially obscured by a bend in the creek bed, stood one of Bennett's men, not the sniper, but another of the 4 Mason had observed at their camp. The man was positioned as if anticipating their route, rifle ready, scanning the surrounding forest. Wallace silently slipped the handgun from his pocket and offered it to Mason, who shook his head firmly. Despite everything, he had never fired a weapon at another human being, and something deep within him resisted crossing that line. Instead, he pointed to the dense thicket of rhododendron that grew along the creek bank to their left, an alternative route that would bypass the guard's position. Moving with agonizing slowness to avoid rustling the vegetation, they worked their way through the tangled branches of the rhododendron thicket. The glossy evergreen leaves provided excellent concealment, but made silent movement nearly impossible. Every snap of a twig or displacement of a branch seemed magnified in Mason's hyper-alert state. They were nearly past the guard's position when disaster struck. Wallace, navigating a particularly dense section of undergrowth, put weight on his injured leg at an awkward angle. The old wound, never fully healed, gave way with an audible pop. The ranger suppressed a cry of pain, but couldn't prevent his collapse against the surrounding vegetation, creating a cascade of movement and noise through the thicket. The guard's reaction was immediate. His rifle swung toward the disturbance, and he began moving cautiously toward their position, using proper tactical approach methods that confirmed Wallace's assessment of military or professional training. Trapped in the dense vegetation with Wallace temporarily immobilized, they faced an immediate crisis. The approaching guard would discover them within seconds, and their concealed position would become a death trap. In that moment of desperate need, help arrived from an unexpected quarter. A chorus of wolf howls erupted from multiple directions simultaneously, startlingly close and disorienting in their overlapping patterns. The guard froze his attention, diverted by this new potential threat. The distraction lasted only seconds, but it was enough. Wallace recovered his balance, and together they slipped away from the guard's position, using the continued wolf calls as acoustic cover for their movement. By the time the man resumed his approach to the rhododendron thicket, they had gained enough distance to avoid discovery. The howling continued, moving in patterns that suggested the wolves were circling the area while creating confusion and uncertainty among Bennett's men, while simultaneously providing a form of guidance to Mason and Wallace. By following the shifting source of the howls, they navigated around 2 additional guard positions before finally reaching the base of the rock formation that was their destination. The formation itself presented one final challenge, a 30-foot climb up exposed rock face to reach the defensive position at its summit. Wallace's injured leg made this nearly impossible for him, and remaining at the base would leave them vulnerable. "Go, get to the high ground. I'll create a diversion, draw them away." Mason shook his head emphatically. "The day you pulled me from that mining shaft, you made a choice. Today, I'm making the same one. We go together or not at all." The determination in the boy's voice, no longer a boy in any way that mattered, brooked no argument. Together, they located a less direct route up the formation, a series of ledges and natural steps that would allow Wallace to ascend despite his injury. The climb was agonizingly slow, each movement carefully considered to minimize noise and visibility. They reached the summit just as the afternoon sun dipped behind gathering clouds, bringing premature dusk to the mountain. The defensive position was as effective as Wallace had promised, a natural fortress of stone with clear sight lines in all directions and multiple covered positions from which to observe or, if necessary, defend. Most importantly, Wallace's old Ranger cache remained undisturbed beneath a flat stone, emergency supplies, additional ammunition, and a higher-powered radio that could reach the ranger station directly without relying on relay frequencies that Bennett might be monitoring. Using this equipment, Wallace established direct communication with Sheriff Daniels, who confirmed that response teams were already mobilizing both sheriff's deputies and state police tactical units. The challenge now was surviving until help arrived, a process complicated by the approaching weather system, visible on the horizon, dark thunderclouds that promised both concealment and additional hazards. From their elevated position, they spotted 2 of Bennett's men converging on the area where they had last been tracked, methodically searching the undergrowth with the patience of experienced hunters. The sniper remained in his elevated position on the north ridge, while the 4th man, presumably Bennett himself, was not visible from their vantage point. As darkness and the storm approached simultaneously, their situation grew increasingly precarious. The rock formation provided physical protection, but was dangerously exposed to lightning. Remaining in place risked hypothermia in the coming rain. Moving would expose them to the searchers below. The decision was made for them when a flash of movement caught Mason's eye. Bennett himself now visible as he directed his men's search pattern from a position near the base of their rock formation. He carried no rifle but had a handgun holstered at his side, his attention focused on a handheld device that Mason recognized as a thermal imaging scanner technology that would render their concealment useless once darkness fell completely. "We need to move before that storm hits and before full dark," Mason whispered. "That scanner will pick us up easily once there's no ambient heat to mask our signatures." Wallace nodded grimly, acknowledging both the threat and their limited options. The nearest alternative shelter was his emergency cave, a natural formation he had stocked with supplies years earlier, located nearly 2 miles distant across increasingly hazardous terrain. Their descent from the rock formation utilized the gathering darkness as concealment, each movement timed between lightning flashes that would have silhouetted them against the skyline. They reached the ground level just as the first heavy raindrops began to fall, nature providing a final element to their concealment strategy. The storm's arrival worked both for and against them. The driving rain reduced visibility and would eventually render Bennett's thermal scanner less effective as ambient temperatures equalized. But it also turned the forest floor treacherous, transforming dry creek beds into rushing torrents and making every slope a potential slide hazard. They had covered perhaps half a mile, moving generally northward toward the emergency cave, when Wallace stumbled again, his injured leg simply giving out on a slick section of trail. This time the fall was more serious. Mason heard the sickening crack of bone, even over the storm's rumble, followed by Wallace's sharply indrawn breath that spoke of pain too intense to vocalize. Broken lower leg. His face, ghostly in the intermittent lightning flashes, showed both agony and resignation. "You have to go on alone. Get to the cave. Sheriff knows to look for us there." Mason assessed their situation with the cold clarity that survival in these mountains had taught him. Wallace couldn't walk. Carrying him across 2 miles of storm-lashed mountain terrain was physically impossible. Staying in place meant certain discovery once Bennett's men widened their search pattern. Yet leaving Wallace behind was equally unthinkable. This man had saved him multiple times, had taught him everything he knew about survival, had become more family to him than many blood relations. There had to be another option. The answer came from an unexpected source. As Mason scanned their surroundings for some solution, his gaze caught movement, familiar gray shapes materializing from the rain-soaked forest. The wolf pack had found them once again, the lead animal approaching with that same deliberate intelligence Mason had witnessed before. The wolf stopped a few yards away, its yellow eyes reflecting the lightning flashes as it studied them. Then it moved to a position just past Wallace and sat looking back expectantly, the same gesture it had used previously to indicate a path to safety. "You've got to be kidding me," Wallace whispered, pain momentarily forgotten in disbelief. "They're showing us a route." Mason was already moving to investigate, following the wolf's indicated direction. Just a few yards beyond their position, partially concealed by undergrowth and falling water, yawned the entrance to a small cave, not Wallace's emergency shelter, but a natural formation unknown to either of them, despite their extensive exploration of these mountains. The lead wolf watched as Mason examined the opening, then trotted to the entrance and entered without hesitation, clearly demonstrating its safety. Mason returned to Wallace's side and helped him to a sitting position. Its dry sheltered and invisible from more than a few feet away. Perfect temporary refuge. Together they managed the agonizing process of moving Wallace to the cave entrance and then inside, where dry ground and protection from the storm awaited. The cave extended perhaps 20 feet into the mountainside, its floor remarkably level and free from debris, as if it had been prepared for human occupation. Most surprising was what awaited them deeper inside, evidence that this place had indeed been used by humans before. Ancient stone tools, fragments of pottery, and what appeared to be ritualistic markings on the walls all suggested this had once been a sacred or special place to the indigenous peoples who had lived here long before European settlement. Wallace examined the artifacts with reverent care despite his pain. Cherokee Shelter Cave. My grandmother told stories about places like this, sacred spaces where their hunters could find protection during storms or danger. The wolves, apparently satisfied with delivering their human charges to safety, retreated to the cave entrance, where they established a natural sentry line, the adults positioning themselves to watch multiple approaches, while the younger animals remained further inside, occasionally approaching Mason with curious sniffs. Using the first aid supplies from their packs, Mason stabilized Wallace's broken leg as best he could, creating a splint from straight branches and binding it with torn strips of cloth. The pain remained intense, but the ranger's color improved once the limb was immobilized and his breathing steadied. Outside, the storm intensified, sheets of rain transforming the forest into a water-lashed chaos illuminated by frequent lightning. Thunder rolled continuously through the mountain valleys, drowning out any sounds of human pursuit. Nature herself seemed determined to shield them, at least temporarily, from Bennett and his men. Mason established a small, well-shielded fire near the cave's entrance, using the emergency supplies from Wallace's ranger cache. The flames provided minimal warmth and light, without creating smoke that might give away their position. In its flickering illumination, the wolf pack settled into a loose semicircle, some dozing, while others maintained vigilant watch. The surreal quality of the scene, humans and wolves sharing shelter against common danger, was not lost on Mason. A year ago, he would have found such a situation terrifying or unbelievable. Now it felt strangely right, as if ancient patterns were reasserting themselves in a moment of crisis. Wallace watched the wolves with a mixture of pain-hazed wonder and deep recognition. My grandmother would say, "You have powerful medicine, boy." In the old stories, wolves only offered such alliances to humans with special spirits. Mason shook his head, uncomfortable with any suggestion of mystical selection. I was just desperate enough to listen when they tried to communicate. Anyone would have done the same. The old ranger's smile suggested he knew better, but wouldn't press the point. These mountains have ways of testing people, revealing their true nature. Most fail that test. You didn't. The night passed in alternating periods of vigilant watch and brief, fitful sleep. The storm gradually diminished to steady rain, then to scattered showers as dawn approached. With first light came renewed danger. Bennett and his men would resume their search with the advantages of daylight and clearer weather. The wolf pack departed, with the coming of dawn slipping away silently into the mist-shrouded forest. Only the lead animal remained, momentarily fixing Mason with that uncanny, intelligent gaze before following its pack into the wilderness. Their message seemed clear. Daylight protection was beyond their power to provide. Mason ventured cautiously to the cave entrance, surveying the surrounding forest for any sign of human movement. The storm had transformed the landscape overnight. Small streams now raged as torrents loose. Rocks had shifted to create new patterns, and several trees had fallen, creating both obstacles and potential cover for movement. The radio crackled to life, Sheriff Daniels' voice tense but controlled. "Wallace Wright, if you're receiving, be advised we have teams approaching your last known coordinates." Bennett's vehicle was spotted abandoned at Forest Service Road 27. "We believe he has 3 men with him, all armed. State Police helicopter will be on station within the hour, weather permitting." The news brought both hope and renewed tension. Help was approaching, but not yet close enough to prevent a final confrontation if Bennett located their position. Wallace's injury made further movement nearly impossible, meaning they would have to defend their current position if discovered. Mason consulted the topographical map from Wallace's pack, locating their approximate position relative to known ranger patrol routes. The sheriff's teams would likely approach from the south, following established trails. Bennett's group had been moving generally northeast in their search pattern before the storm hit. The cave entrance faced west, potentially visible to anyone approaching from that direction. "We need to obscure the entrance," Mason concluded, studying the surrounding vegetation. "Create a blind that looks natural, but allows us to see out and move if necessary." Working with careful efficiency, he gathered fallen branches, ferns, and other natural materials, arranging them to partially conceal the cave opening while maintaining visibility and emergency exit capabilities. The work required multiple trips into the surrounding forest, each one a calculated risk of exposure. During one such foray, Mason froze at the sound of human voices carrying through the mist-laden air. Bennett's men closer than expected, discussing search patterns. He dropped flat behind a fallen log, controlling his breathing as Wallace had taught him during hunting lessons. Through gaps in the vegetation, Mason could see 2 of Bennett's men, the original sniper, and one other, both carrying rifles and moving with the disciplined caution of professionals. They were working a grid pattern, methodically covering ground in a way that would eventually bring them to the cave's location. Most concerning was their conversation, which revealed Bennett's ultimate plan. "Once we find them, Nathan wants it handled quietly. No witnesses, no evidence. Make it look like an accident or animal attack. Then we burn any remaining documentation and clear out before the sheriff's people get here." The other man grunted acknowledgement. "What about the wolf sign? Never seen anything like it. Almost like they're running interference, drawing us away from certain areas." "Just animals. Focus on the targets." Mason retreated to the cave with this disturbing intelligence, moving with extreme caution to avoid detection. Wallace received the news with grim resignation. "Nathan's desperate. The trial date's set, the evidence is strong, and his money's running out on legal delays. This is his last play: eliminate witnesses, destroy evidence, create reasonable doubt." Sheriff Daniels had estimated their response time at approximately 1 hour. Based on the search pattern, Mason had observed Bennett's men would discover their location in less than 30 minutes. The mathematics of survival had never been more starkly clear. Wallace checked his rifle and handgun methodically, his ranger training evident in every movement despite his injury. "We hold this position. Create fields of fire that force them to approach from disadvantageous angles. Make every shot count. Mason nodded, accepting the tactical necessity while still grappling with the moral weight of what might be required. He had survived in these mountains through intelligence adaptation and harmony with natural systems. The prospect of deliberate violence, even in self-defense, represented a threshold he had not yet crossed. Preparations complete, they settled into defensive positions with clear fields of view outside the cave. Minutes stretched into a half hour with no sign of Bennett's men, raising hopes that the search pattern might miss their location entirely. Then a flash of movement caught Mason's eye, not approaching from the expected direction, but materializing directly in front of the cave entrance. The lead wolf had returned alone this time, its coat wet from passage through the dew-laden undergrowth. It fixed Mason with that familiar, intelligent stare, then deliberately looked toward the eastern approach to the cave before returning its gaze to Mason. The warning was unmistakable. Danger approaching from the east, the opposite direction from which they had been watching. Mason signaled to Wallace, who shifted position silently to cover the new threat vector. They were not a moment too soon. Bennett himself appeared from the eastern forest edge, moving with the confident stealth of an experienced hunter. Unlike his men with their tactical rifles, he carried only a handgun, a pragmatic choice for close-quarter combat in dense forest. Most telling was the item in his other hand, not the thermal scanner Mason had seen earlier, but a satellite phone presumably maintaining contact with his dispersed search team. The wolf melted away into the forest as Bennett approached, its warning delivered. Mason and Wallace remained motionless in their concealed positions, weapons ready but held in reserve. Direct confrontation remained the last resort. Their primary goal was survival until the sheriff's teams arrived. Bennett paused at the edge of the small clearing before the cave, surveying the surroundings with practiced eyes. For a heart-stopping moment, his gaze seemed to fix directly on their position, despite the camouflage Mason had created. Then, with deliberate slowness, he raised the satellite phone to his ear. "I've got movement near the Western Ridge cave system. Converge on my position." The words sent ice through Mason's veins. Bennett hadn't spotted them precisely, but he was dangerously close and had just summoned reinforcements. Within minutes, they would be surrounded by armed men with clear intent to kill. Wallace's expression hardened with resolve. When they converge, they'll be exposed momentarily. "That's our window." Mason understood the implication. They would allow Bennett's men to gather, then create a diversion that would allow them to slip away during the momentary confusion. It was a desperate strategy with minimal chance of success given Wallace's injury, but it represented their only alternative to a direct firefight. Before they could implement this plan, nature intervened once again. The distinctive whopping of helicopter rotors cut through the mountain air, the promised state police air support arriving ahead of schedule. Bennett froze, then spoke urgently into the satellite phone, clearly ordering his men to take cover and maintain separation to avoid aerial detection. The helicopter appeared over the ridge to the south, its distinctive blue and gray law enforcement livery clearly visible as it began a systematic search pattern over the forest. Bennett melted back into the tree line, temporarily retreating from the cave area, but not abandoning the search entirely. For nearly 20 minutes, the helicopter worked a grid pattern over the surrounding terrain, occasionally hovering over areas of interest. Wallace used their emergency signal mirror to flash coded messages toward the aircraft whenever its flight path brought it within line of sight of their position. Finally, the helicopter's search pattern shifted, focusing increasingly on their specific area. Through his improvised spyglass, Mason could see the observer using high-powered optics to scan the ground below. Then the aircraft dipped in acknowledgement and banked away, apparently having spotted their signal. Sheriff Daniels' voice came through the radio with renewed urgency. "We have your approximate position from air observation. Ground teams converging from south and west. State police have thermal imaging showing 4 armed individuals in your vicinity. Hold position if secure. Acknowledge if possible." Wallace transmitted a brief confirmation code, nothing that would give away their exact location if Bennett was monitoring frequencies, but enough to confirm they had received the message. The final phase of the confrontation unfolded with surprising swiftness. Bennett, apparently recognizing that law enforcement's net was tightening, made a calculated decision to accelerate his timeline. Using the satellite phone, he recalled his dispersed team for one final coordinated effort to locate and eliminate the witnesses against him. Mason and Wallace watched from concealment as Bennett's men converged on his position, gathering at the eastern edge of the clearing before the cave. Their conversation, though partially inaudible, made clear their desperate intent, a final systematic sweep of the immediate area before being forced to withdraw by approaching law enforcement. Just as the group prepared to move out, a new sound echoed through the forest. Wolf howls not from a single animal, but from what sounded like dozens, creating a surround sound effect that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. The eerie chorus froze Bennett and his men momentarily, their heads swiveling as they tried to locate the source of the unsettling noise. In that moment of distraction, the first sheriff's deputies appeared at the western edge of the clearing, weapons drawn and commands shouted. Bennett's men reacted instinctively, raising their rifles in what proved to be a fatal error. The law enforcement response was immediate and overwhelming, precise fire that neutralized the armed threat without opportunity for surrender that wouldn't have been offered anyway. Bennett himself reacted differently, diving for cover behind a fallen log and returning fire with his handgun while attempting to create an escape route to the north. In the ensuing chaos of gunfire and shouted commands, he nearly succeeded in slipping away. Nearly. As Bennett broke cover and sprinted for the denser forest to the north, a gray shadow detached itself from the undergrowth directly in his path. The lead wolf stood its ground, hackles raised, yellow eyes fixed on the fleeing human with unmistakable intent. Behind it, more wolves appeared, forming a living barrier across Bennett's escape route. The man skidded to a halt, his attention fatally divided between the animal threat before him and the human one behind. That moment of indecision provided the opening for sheriff's deputies to close the distance and subdue him without further bloodshed. Within minutes, the clearing was secured, Bennett and his surviving associate in custody, the threat neutralized. Medical personnel attended to Wallace's broken leg, while Mason provided a preliminary statement to Sheriff Daniels detailing the events of the past 24 hours. Throughout the flurry of activity, the medical evacuation, the evidence collection, the securing of the scene, Mason found his attention repeatedly drawn to the surrounding forest edges. The wolf pack had vanished as completely as they had appeared, leaving no trace of their intervention. Yet their impact remained indelible, not just in the practical outcome of the confrontation, but in the deeper understanding they had awakened in a boy who had entered these mountains as an abandoned victim and would leave them as something else entirely. 2 years after being abandoned in the wilderness, Mason stood at the edge of the newly established Wright Mountain Education Center, a cornerstone project of the conservation trust his family had created to protect the 5,000-acre watershed. The modern facility, built with sustainable materials and designed to blend with the natural environment, served multiple purposes. Headquarters for ongoing research into mountain ecosystems, base for ranger operations, and most importantly, a place where young people could learn the survival skills and environmental appreciation that had transformed Mason's own life. Wallace, now officially the center's director, despite his frequent protests that he was too old for titles, stood beside him. The ranger's leg had healed remarkably well considering the severity of the break, though he still used a carved walking stick on longer hikes. His role had evolved from solitary mountain dweller to reluctant educator, sharing decades of wilderness knowledge with increasingly appreciative audiences. The legal aftermath of the Bennett confrontation had unfolded largely as expected. Nathan faced multiple life sentences for attempted murder, conspiracy, and a host of lesser charges. His surviving associate had accepted a plea deal in exchange for testimony about the broader network of environmental exploitation Bennett had established throughout the region. Most importantly, the Wright family's ownership of the watershed land had been irrefutably established, allowing the Conservation Trust to implement protections that would preserve the area for generations to come. Mason's parents had found unexpected purpose in the aftermath as well. His father had transitioned from corporate accounting to managing the trust's finances full-time, applying his skills to conservation rather than profit. His mother had completed her book about Mason's survival story, which had become an unexpected bestseller and spawned a broader series on youth resilience and environmental connection. For Mason himself, now 14, the future held both certainty and infinite possibility. He divided his time between the mountains and the city, attending a progressive school that incorporated his wilderness experiences into a formal educational framework. He maintained his cabin, expanding and improving it with each season while developing a comprehensive journal of mountain knowledge that combined Wallace's teachings with his own observations. The wolf pack remained a consistent, if mysterious, presence in his mountain life. Though never tame, they had established a relationship with Mason that defied conventional understanding of wolf-human interactions. They would appear unexpectedly during his solo hikes, sometimes accompanying him for miles before vanishing back into the forest. Wildlife biologists studying the phenomenon remain baffled, but increasingly convinced that something unprecedented was occurring, a deliberate choice by the wolves to associate with a specific human. On this particular autumn afternoon, with the forest ablaze in seasonal color, Mason and Wallace watched as the center's first official student group departed 20 teenagers from surrounding communities, many from disadvantaged backgrounds, who had spent a week learning basic wilderness skills and ecological principles. "These kids remind me of you. When you first arrived," Wallace observed, his weathered face creased with a rare smile. Skeptical, a little scared, thinking nature's their enemy. Mason nodded, recognizing the pattern. By week's end, most had undergone at least the beginning stages of the transformation he had experienced, moving from fear to fascination, from separation to connection. A distant howl echoed from the ridgeline above, a familiar voice that Mason could now recognize individually from among the pack. He smiled, knowing what the sound signified. Somewhere on the mountain, new life was stirring, wolf pups born to the next generation, continuing a lineage that had roamed these forests since time immemorial. Wallace caught his expression and nodded in understanding. "The mountains endure. They were here long before us. They'll be here long after. Our job is to learn from them while we can protect them while we're able." Mason's gaze traveled from the educational center to his cabin on the distant ridge, to the white pines that had sheltered him during those first desperate days, and finally to the high peaks, still touched with golden afternoon light. These mountains had nearly killed him, then saved him, then transformed him. They had stripped away everything he thought defined him, then rebuilt him into someone stronger, more authentic, more connected to the fundamental rhythms of the natural world. The city still called to him occasionally, the comfort of technology, the ease of climate-controlled environments, the structured predictability of urban life. But those calls grew fainter with each season that passed, each skill he mastered, each moment of perfect wilderness communion. These mountains had claimed him, and he had claimed them in return. Whatever future awaited beyond these ridges and valleys, that fundamental truth would remain etched into his very being, as surely as water shapes stone, wind sculpts trees, and wilderness forges human character.